Louisiana, as many of you know, is #1 in many things nationally. That includes crawfish production and shrimp and prawn production. I don't know if any of you know the difference between shrimp and prawns, but perhaps those who do should get a MacArthur Genius Award if you don't have to look that up on your phone, but it has to do with how many of the legs have claws. Also, Louisiana is #1 in the production of turtles. 62% of the 3.5 million turtles sold in the U.S. are from Louisiana. But there's one thing that by the end of this year, Louisiana is not going to be #1 in. That's its incarceration rate. So kudos to all the people, many in this room, who had a lot to do with that. I'm pleased that our state director for Right on Crime, Elaine Ellerby, has been here for the whole conference, and it really is noteworthy. And, you know, obviously we do talk a lot about incarceration rates, but I always say cutting costs, cutting incarceration, that's the appetizer. The main course is public safety, keeping families together, reintegrating people into the workforce. And so I think that what I would say is John Creuzot, a great drug court judge in Dallas, once said a monkey could send someone to jail, and it's also true a monkey could let someone out of jail. But what it takes is the people in this room who are implementing evidence-based practices, who are providing the support upon reentry, so that it's not just about reducing incarceration, it's also at the same time continuing to reduce crime and getting people back reintegrated into our society. So thank you for all the work you are doing with evidence-based practices and smart solutions, and I'm going to talk about some of those today. So let me just give you a brief introduction to Right on Crime. It's part of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is the conservative free market think tank in Texas. And as many of you know, we have a statement of principles that's signed by conservative leaders from Newt Gingrich to Rick Perry, Grover Norquist, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee just signed on about a week or two ago. And it has really, I think, helped us change the national discourse and emphasize that criminal justice reform, it's not just a liberal issue, it's also an issue that conservatives should care about. So this isn't really that new, though, when you think about it. In our country, we had about a 5- to 6-fold increase in incarceration from the early 70s to the mid-2000s. And back when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, he bragged in his State of the State speech in 1971 that fewer people were going to prison than ever before. More people were succeeding on probation and parole. But starting in the mid-70s, the country took a much different course with sending more and more people to prison. People gave up on the idea that alternatives to incarceration could work. But fortunately, we've had a lot of research and we have a lot more knowledge now about ways to think outside the cell and reduce crime through other methods than just putting more people behind bars. So we start with a number of philosophical principles that we bring to bear on this issue. First of all, that the government should focus first and foremost on that conduct which harms other people. Obviously, violent crime, #1, property offenses, and then use the least restrictive alternative to addressing those when it comes to liberty. So you don't want to choose a sanction that's more restrictive than necessary to ensure public safety. Obviously emphasizing the role of victims, redemption, family preservation, making sure we're not too tough on taxpayers, and also both holding offenders and the system accountable for results. Now, I actually started the criminal justice work of our foundation in Texas back in 2005, and that is what led to Right on Crime, because fortunately, policymakers in Texas, starting really in 2007, took some major steps to change our criminal justice system. And the main impetus behind that was we had a projection back in January of 2017, January 2007, excuse me, by our legislative budget board that Texas would need to build 17,000 more prison beds on the top of the 155,000 it already had, unless we changed our policies. Now, thankfully, we did change those policies. We expanded drug courts and other alternatives to incarceration, mental health treatment, and the results are clear. Over the 10-year period, we've seen a 33% drop in our index crime rate and almost 17% reduction in our incarceration rate. As of September 1st of this year, Texas has closed 8 prisons. So one of the ways I think is helpful to think about the challenges in the criminal justice system is to apply the lessons from medicine to criminal justice. And if you look in medicine, a doctor decides the course of treatment first after making a diagnosis of the person that's before them. They look at the efficacy of different treatments, and in other words, what outcomes those have led to for other patients with a similar illness in the past. Now, in the criminal justice system, at least that of the past, not what all of you are doing here. The disposition of the case is driven entirely by rigid sentencing rules, and you're not able to look at the specifics of the individual before you, and you're not able to look at prior outcomes of similar offenders. Then, and also in medicine, the dosage is very important, and the type of treatment, and then you adjust those based on the progress of the individual, which you're constantly monitoring. Now, too often in the criminal justice system in the past, the initial disposition is driven by a particular law or regulation, and then, of course, in the pretrial context, a lot based on how much the person can afford to pay, whether they stay in jail or are put on some form of pretrial release. Then, of course, in medicine, we take precautions to prevent relapse, whereas in the criminal justice system, we actually apply a lot of collateral consequences around employment, housing, which actually make recidivism more likely. So this definitely demonstrates how we need to change and transform how we approach this. Now, jails, where many of your work centers around, are indeed both the front door and the backstop when it comes to the criminal justice system. 12 million admissions every year to our jails. In many communities, if someone's having an overdose, a psychotic breakdown, there's simply no other place to bring them but to the jail. And a lot of that stems from, of course, the deinstitutionalization of our mental institutions in the 70s. That was supposed to be replaced with community-based services, but in most instances it wasn't. Since 1977, local jails have grown sixfold, and now more than 700,000 people every day are in those local jails. Now, as many of you know, more than 60% of the folks in local jails are awaiting trial. The local jail populations have quadrupled since 1977, but what's interesting is in the last few years, we've seen a significant decline in jail populations in major urban counties. Suburban counties have actually started to decline slightly, but rural areas and small cities are continuing to increase at a very high rate. Indeed, since 1970, rural jail populations are up a whopping 888%, according to the Vera Institute. Now, one of the other culprits in this is the amount of bail that's set. Now, over the last decade in California, this is on average every year, bail amounts have gone up 22% a year. Now, most people's salaries have not done that. So the average length of stay in our jails has gone from 9 to 23 days over the last 4 decades. Now, one of the key issues, and this arose in the Harris County jail litigation. We have a great team from Harris County here, people I've worked with for many years, but the problem becomes someone essentially gets the bulk of their punishment before their case is ever adjudicated, before they're convicted, because many times they end up getting probation or time served. So it does, in fact, pervert the order of the traditional justice process where you would be adjudicated and convicted and then punished. Now, the cost of this is very significant, $13.6 billion a year for pretrial incarceration. And significantly, what the research has shown from the Arnold Foundation, from the University of Cincinnati, is once somebody is in jail for 24, 48, particularly 72 hours, then they're starting to miss work, they're starting to become disconnected from their family, and if they were low risk at the beginning, their risk is actually increasing as their time in jail continues. So let me highlight some of the solutions that I'm going to go through here. First of all, we have to determine what should be a crime and what a conduct ought to be subject to jail time. We need to look at reducing or discontinuing a number of the fines and fees that lead people to go to jail for inability to pay, expanding police diversion, enhancing and expediting pretrial risk assessment, reforming money bail, expediting the provision of counsel, streamlining case processing, alternative sentencing for misdemeanors, more compliance with supervision conditions so that we actually have fewer revocations, and improving reentry from jail. Now, what we've heard, obviously, in this conference so far is the folks in here are already doing these things, so I probably won't be telling you too much you don't already know. But let's start with the fact that we have so many criminal laws. Now, most of these are silly things that don't actually lead to people going to jail, but still, you do see the case of a woman in Texas arrested for an overdue library book, or another woman who was selling homemade tamales on the internet, which violated a city ordinance, and she got an arrest warrant. But more commonly, of course, you have issues like small amounts of marijuana, driving without a license, petty theft, and so forth. And we passed a law in Texas back in 2007 that gave police the discretion to issue a summons for those things, cite and summons, and a number of counties, and actually San Antonio just started several weeks ago implementing this. Now, debtors' prisons are a huge issue, and in some jurisdictions, up to 20% of the people going to jail are for failure to pay a fine and fee. And in many cases, they simply didn't have the money to do so. So I'm really happy to tell you that earlier this year, both Texas and Louisiana passed legislation that basically instructed courts to give these people alternatives, whether it's a payment plan, community service, but also importantly, reducing the amount that's owed so it's commensurate with a person's income and ability to pay, which is the day fine concept that's of course very common in Europe. Now, one of the reasons we got this bill passed in Texas was in 2007, Bexar County, which is San Antonio, they stopped putting people in jail for inability to pay, and the interesting thing is their collections actually went up in the subsequent years. So that is a perfect example of how if you innovate locally, it makes it much easier to then pass legislation on a statewide basis. Now, one of the solutions is also clearing out the cobwebs of warrants. There's piles of old warrants in jurisdictions across the country. And many of these are failure to appear for traffic violations that would never carry jail time to begin with. Spokane, which is one of the great safety and justice sites, had a warrant fest where people could clear a number of these warrants. They were still held accountable in an appropriate way, but that is very helpful. In Manhattan, they found stuff 10 years or more ago that isn't even prosecuted anymore, in some cases isn't even a crime anymore, and they've cleared those warrants out as well. Now, one of the things that we have to do is really focus on prevention and policing to deter crime rather than just processing people. And George Kelling, who was instrumental in designing the data-driven policing CompStat that was implemented in New York City, he basically said, instead of just focusing on the resources to process more people in the system, the idea that we need more police, more prosecutors, we actually need to use police in a way to deter crime and use other means to prevent crime. There's an interesting study that basically looked when there was Homeland Security alerts in Washington, D.C. in certain parts of the city, the number of car burglaries and auto thefts went dramatically down in those areas because of that deterrence. But there's also the need to, for example, with people that are mentally ill, have these alternative resources, have police have another place they can bring them. So essentially what you have is police actually starving the system rather than feeding the system through these types of alternatives. So Seattle is a perfect example of that with the LEAD program that I think many of you are familiar with. There was a certain part of downtown Seattle where they had it was mostly homeless people, but they were sleeping in front of residences, sleeping in front of businesses. Many of them were addicted to drugs, some passed out. And so the community came together and said, let's do something different instead of just having a revolving door through the jail. And they had a caseworker and basically connecting them with services, including temporary emergency housing, and the results have been dramatic. Recidivism is down 60%. They've saved millions on emergency room visits for these folks, and this has all been evaluated in a controlled study, and so other parts of the country are now replicating this program. Another example is the civil citation program in Florida that's been so successful it's now expanded beyond youths to adults as well. And again, this is a way, some of you may be familiar with the quarterback Jameis Winston, who didn't go to jail for stealing crab legs from Publix, but instead went into the civil citation program. A number of other examples, detox, sobriety centers. There's a 24-hour mental health crisis center in San Antonio where someone's yelling at McDonald's, they can bring them there instead of the jail. Victim offender mediation and so forth, but these other tools that police can have instead of just bringing someone to jail. Now, as we move deeper into the process, for those people that do arrive in jail, it's critical to have a risk assessment as soon as possible. And Kentucky has been a pioneer on this, implementing a statewide risk assessment back in 2013, and they found no drop in appearance rates, 15% fewer new offenses. So obviously it has to be validated on the specific population, but this is something jurisdictions around the country are doing. And one of the important things to emphasize is these assessments are not just about risk, they're also about needs. And so identifying the particular treatment needs, housing needs, and so forth of that individual. And in Pima County, they've been able to implement in the last year a mental health screening tool that's had a tremendous impact and has helped them reduce their jail population by 15% year over year. One of the particular areas many jurisdictions are looking at is the, quote, frequent flyers. They found people in Houston that are mentally ill that have been to jail 50 times in 1 year, often for things like criminal trespass. And so you can actually have a home visiting program where you have whether it's a probation officer, a caseworker, et cetera, come there, make sure that person's taking their medication and doing their counseling sessions, and you see the jail visits really plummet. Now, a critical issue, of course, once somebody is in jail is the issue of bail. And fortunately, many jurisdictions are tackling the need for bail reform, really in light of the research that shows that these assessments are much more accurate in predicting both failure to appear and a new offense, new arrest, than somebody's wealth. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about commercial bail. There's a tendency to view it as a free market solution, like if I went into Walmart and bought a product, but in reality, the individual who's getting the bail issued is not the consumer, perhaps the judge or the public, but anytime you have that separation of the consumer and the service, you have a lot of distortions. But the critical point is the in-out decision ought to be made without regard to wealth, and then you set conditions, including any financial conditions, whether it's collateral or otherwise. Now, one of the reasons, to be blunt, that some jurisdictions are pursuing this is they want to avoid litigation. I referenced earlier the Fifth Circuit case that's pending where Harris County, there was a federal court that ruled against Harris County in their bail case. And one of the critical issues is they found 40% of the misdemeanants couldn't make the bail that was set. And the interesting thing is almost all those people ended up getting time served or time served plus a day. So coming back to they were punished, really the only punishment occurred before they were ever adjudicated. And this is for misdemeanors. That case only deals with misdemeanor bail, so I want to be very clear about that. Now, New Jersey implemented a statewide bail reform that many of you are familiar with, and it's going to take some additional time to fully evaluate the results from that, but certainly we know the jail population statewide are down 20%. As far as it actually gave judges considerable latitude in a wide range of cases to deny bail. They had a constitutional amendment, but there was a lot of training for judges in how to interpret assessments and so forth. And the result has been 87% of people are released with some conditions in many cases. 13% are detained, which is a lower number than before this reform. It's down about 2/3. And then the rearrest rate, for example, 8%. And only 3 of those were for violent offenses. Now, they have made some tweaks, for example, relating to weapons charges since the initial law was passed. One of the critical issues that I think gets overlooked a lot in this discussion is the role of indigent defense. As we all know, constitutionally, a person can't enter a plea to an offense carrying jail time without an attorney. Unfortunately, it often takes a long time to provide somebody an attorney, but there's jurisdictions like Miami and Seattle that now, in virtually all cases, within 24 hours, the person does indeed get representation, and that really helps move the whole process along. Obviously, it takes resources. The good thing is some of the savings from the jails can be reinvested in indigent defense, in pretrial services, police diversion, a lot of the things that we're talking about today. So one of the particular innovations that I'm very excited about is a pilot program in Texas, which the Indigent Defense Commission helped Comal County implement, and something we've written about, which is client choice. The idea that the individual could actually choose among a list of qualified attorneys whose caseloads are kept track of by the local bar or the county, rather than having the judge appoint that attorney. And there was an evaluation of this pilot program by the Justice Management Institute, which showed excellent results in terms of client satisfaction and so forth. So that is definitely something to take a look at. Case processing, now that's not the sexiest topic, but that is something that makes a big difference, as we've seen in a number of jurisdictions. One example was Justice Reboot in New York City, which recently was put into place. 95% of cases now that were more than a year old have been resolved. And basically what happens is everyone who's involved in the case gets a snapshot on an ongoing basis, and it shows how many people are being held in pretrial detention, how many are longer than the 180-day target, the median length of adjournments, median number of days from indictment to arraignment, and so forth. Now, Shelby County, Tennessee is another example. The over 500 days list of those in custody for these extended periods pre-trial, it's circulated every month to judges, public defender, prosecutors, and so forth. And then you have a coordinating committee that goes over that and looks at what can be done to resolve those cases. Now, this obviously illustrates the need for collaboration and data sharing that so many of you are really involved in. I think that the whole thing of the, quote, criminal justice system, because it's not a system in the way of an assembly line or a well-oiled machine, there's lots of different entities involved, and many of them are independent elected officials and so forth. So to establish a coordinating council, for example, is really important so that there's communication and everyone's on the same page. Sometimes you may need new positions. In Palm Beach County, they created court navigator positions that basically link the state attorney and public defender's offices. They go over the data from the Criminal Justice Commission, and they identify those people on low bonds that have been there for 3 to 10 days, and they develop a plan to get them out of jail. So now we've spent, obviously most of the time, rightfully so, talking about pretrial, because that is the majority of those filling the local jails. But then again, there's also some people who are sentenced for misdemeanors. You also have those who are waiting to be picked up by your state correctional systems, which often is another problem. But when it comes to those in jail sentenced on misdemeanors, obviously there's a need to make sure there are other alternatives that judges can look at. And one of the particular issues that we've identified in various counties in Texas is if somebody's already served a bunch of time in jail pre-trial, and most counties give 2 for 1 or 3 for 1, then by the time their case is disposed of, oftentimes they would have a disincentive to choose probation or some other alternative because, in fact, they've gotten so much credit in terms of their time served that whatever the additional sentence is, it's not going to actually amount to them being there much longer. And of course, the other aspect of it is if you've already lost your job, if you've got nothing to go back to, getting on probation where you have to find a job and meet a lot of other conditions isn't that attractive. So this is very much linked to the pretrial decision making, but certainly there's a number of things we can do, from residential drug treatment, mental health treatment. Day reporting centers are another approach, along with work release. Kern County, California is one example where they implemented a day reporting center, and they looked at a control group study, and 57% lower recidivism than those that just were sentenced to jail. So then, of course, once you have somebody, whether it's on pretrial supervision or probation, there's a need to how do we reduce the number of revocations and thereby, or actually promote compliance and thereby reduce the number of revocations. And it starts with tailoring the conditions of the supervision to the risk and needs assessment. We actually passed a law in Texas this year that says judges have to base the conditions on the risk and needs assessment. Employing a matrix of graduated sanctions and incentives, which basically helps with your officers, your pretrial and probation officers, having, whether it's a curfew or a weekend in jail, but other options they can use as opposed to just moving towards revocation. For the technical violations and even some misdemeanors. And then, of course, I mean, the technology has opened a tremendous range of opportunities for us. I think it's very important. You don't want to put electronic monitoring on every offender. It's got to be only for those that are high risk of flight, but the court reminders that so many of your jurisdictions are using are great, whether it's by text or a call to their cell phone or whatever. There's apps now. So there's a whole range of things we can do technologically to promote compliance as well. Now, inevitably, though, there will be people that violate the terms of their pretrial supervision and their probation, and then we have to deal with them again when they come back to the jail. And what I've noticed is, in looking at a number of counties, particularly at their bail schedules, it will often say probation violators or pretrial supervision violators are ineligible for bail. So they have, that person is just going to stay in jail until their case can be heard. So, of course, what I would suggest is that bail schedules, particularly those that don't account for risk and ability to pay, are problematic in themselves, but that we also need to revisit if we are going to make these folks ineligible. Maybe we ought to rethink that and say some technical violations are different than others. There's a big difference between missing an appointment and violating a victim no contact order, for example. And then you actually have to look at why somebody's on probation to begin with. Did they have a prior violent offense and so forth? Now, one of the great examples, St. Louis County, they have a new state probation violation program. They're utilizing jail-based case managers upon booking to identify and then expedite those cases. And they apply a whole, they look at what other new probation conditions do we need to get this person on the right track. And they've been able to reduce their average jail stay from 99 days for these technical probation violators to only 10 days. So with that, I'm really, I know there was a lot of information, but I'm eager to hear your questions and comments. And I want to thank you once again, because y'all are at the tip of the spear of, again, it's not just reducing jail populations, but it's doing it in a way that makes our whole community safer, that reintegrates these individuals back into society, back with their families. So thank you for all your work.
You can also put your questions in the channel. I don't see any yet. All right, here you go. Watch out, Mark.
All right.
Your next number is B14. I'm Mitch Lucas. I'm, excuse me, Charleston, South Carolina, and we had a panel yesterday that one of the things that I believe conservative folks, and I consider myself conservative, is the semantics in the discussion. We talk about criminal justice reform when what we're trying to do is not tear it apart and rebuild it, but we're trying to improve it and make it better all the way around. And all the things that you just said, which by the way, I'd still be on slide 5 if I was doing. You are rapid. But I got my question is, have you in your organization, when you talk to sheriffs and police chiefs and everybody else in the criminal justice system, are semantics a problem, or should we be trying to rephrase the effort that we're doing? Because it seems that as soon as you say reform, I can see people shutting down, and you've got to bring them back up to get them. I'd like to hear your views on that.
No, that's a great question. I think leading with public safety is critical, and I mean, obviously that has to. It's not just a tagline. You actually have to have the numbers and the data to prove that, and obviously reform can mean any number of things, certainly I think all the things we've been discussing, it's not tearing down the system, as you said. It's tweaking it. It's applying what's working in other jurisdictions. And I always say, if you took like the very best programs, because we spotlighted all these, and you've heard from your colleagues. But if you took like the one thing every county's doing that's the best, and you did all those things in every county, you'd probably solve pretty much all of the problems. So it's not. So I definitely agree with you that it's not about tearing down the system. I think that there's sometimes when we talk, I've been to legislative hearings where there's someone who testifies that so-and-so picked up another charge rather than they did X and they were arrested again, right? So sometimes there's a tendency to obfuscate what the person did, and that doesn't really serve anybody. It's better to say, look, this person made a mistake, and the question is, how do we hold them accountable in a way that's going to correct that? Many cases, a matter of correcting criminal thinking patterns, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, all the evidence-based practices, but how do we hold them accountable in a way that's going to get results? And so I think that a lot of times there's a tendency people jump to let's kind of a retributive impulse of how do we get even with this person, and they don't pay as much attention to what do we do with them in a way that's actually going to reduce the risk they're going to commit another crime, and that's really our focus.
The next number is I-21. Mark, we have a question from the app. How does the current administration impact the work of conservative groups like yours in criminal justice?
Wow, well, that's a great question. We, as some of you may have actually saw in the Washington Post, there's actually currently an initiative with the White House, which we're very involved with. And there's people in the administration from Rick Perry to Ben Carson to Jared Kushner that are very, very strongly in favor of criminal justice. I hate to use criminal justice reform again. Let's just say some of the legislation that's pending in Congress, but also some of what the Bureau of Prisons can do on their end. One of the amazing things is I was reading an Office of Inspector General report the other day on the federal prison system, and they're not doing individualized reentry planning. They're not doing the best practices that most of the state corrections systems are doing. It's embarrassing how far they are behind. So I think that there is a lot. Obviously, there's been some changes in terms of the Attorney General that have raised questions, but I think there's a lot of folks in the administration that are very interested in this issue in a very positive way. Obviously, passing anything through Congress has proven to be a Herculean task, but as some of you may have seen, there were several bills filed. It was right after the reports of the meeting at the White House, so I think there might be a connection there. But as members in Congress start to realize this could be one area where you could actually get 60 votes in the Senate, you can get something through. But we still come back to the fact that 90% of the cases are at the state and local level. So regardless of who's in Washington or what they're doing, it has really only an indirect impact. There's some very important technical assistance, grants on justice reinvestment through the Department of Justice. Those seem to be continuing. I haven't seen any problem with that, funding for drug courts and so forth. So that, I haven't heard Attorney General Sessions express any concerns about that whatsoever. His sole area of difference is on federal sentencing reform. But apart from that technical assistance, which is important, this really remains a state and local issue, and that's why we have directors now in 7 different states. We have a couple people in D.C. dealing with the federal issues, but I think keeping our eye on the ball as far as the fact that this is primarily a state and local issue is important.
We have another question in the app. Are there efforts to capture this work in future directions in a national collaborative strategic plan to address identified gaps and solutions across the nation in a systematic manner?
Not quite sure what that was asking, but let me expand on one of the federal things that I think is actually important. We actually, some of you may be familiar with the issue of people in jail losing their Medicaid, their disability, and so forth. And this is actually kind of a tough issue for conservatives, because as conservatives, we like to talk about how we can have fewer people on government programs, but the reality is there's many people that have no alternative that desperately need those programs. But the particular issue was, we found in Texas, people that were maybe even in jail for only a few days were having their disability benefits terminated, for example. And the issue was the sheriffs, instead of waiting 30 days, which is after 30 or 60 days, you have to report them. They do have to be cut off or suspended, at least under federal law. But the idea was, we were able to pass this bill saying, at least wait that time, so most people are out of jail in that time and they have their benefits resumed. And it's particularly important, obviously, for people that are mentally ill, for people that need medications and so forth. So, and then we also included, if people are suspended, if they are in jail more than 30 days, when they get out, we have now an automated process through the Department of State Health Services where they can resume those benefits. So the key was really separating the question of who's eligible, because there's lots of debates about Medicaid eligibility. These people were already on those benefits, so we weren't expanding eligibility. It was just, you shouldn't have your Social Security disability, for example. You shouldn't lose that if you're in jail for a couple of nights and then have to go through a process of reapplying, which can take months. So those are the kinds of smart things, and I think we have to be honest as conservatives that sometimes some of these solutions, these alternatives to incarceration, the reentry solutions, they do cost money sometimes, but they cost a lot less than having a revolving door at your jail or prison, and then not even to say the cost to victims of crimes, which actually there are Insurance Institute actuarial reports which actually do quantify, and for violent crimes you could argue there isn't, no, how do you put a value on a human life, but there are actually ways of measuring that, and when you start to factor in the toll that additional crimes take on people, you realize it's well worth it to do those things that are going to reduce recidivism.
Since you brought up entitlements, one of the things that I'm a veteran, and I'm offended by this, and a lot of people don't know that when a veteran is incarcerated, not convicted, incarcerated, they lose all their VA benefits. That's especially harmful. We had a veteran in and spent $110,000, $120,000 a year for dialysis that he had been getting for decades at the VA. There's been a little bit and this law changed in the 90s. And I don't know why it was changed, but you're dealing with people that have earned a benefit. Have you all had any involvement in that? Every time I say it, someone in the federal government or a legislator, a federal legislator, they get a shocked look on their face, but that's as far as it goes. So are you all seeing any movement on that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it is something that I totally agree with you, and a related issue is the Bureau of Prisons is not connecting people to the VA when they're released. There's no collaboration there, so people aren't even aware if their benefits, how to access them, assuming they still could. But you're certainly correct that, and that is covered by this legislation I talked about in Texas, that it deals with any federal benefits, because what happens is the sheriff reports a list of people that are in their jail, and then all their federal benefits get either suspended or terminated. And so at a minimum, we certainly ought to wait the maximum time under federal law, but ultimately we need to address the issue you're talking about fully. I think federal law needs to be changed.
We have a lot of questions actually that came in through the app, but probably only time for one more. How would you suggest making inroads with conservative stakeholders, sheriffs, legislators, et cetera, who are generally ideologically opposed to criminal justice change? What arguments or rhetoric tend to work better?
Well, I think that, and we've actually seen some polling about this that we and others have done to, mostly of conservative voters, but I think it's fair to assume their attitudes aren't too much different than conservative elected officials. And obviously conservative elected officials, like all elected officials, are concerned about the attitudes of their constituents. And so what we found is certainly you start with some of the areas that resonate the most: nonviolent offenses, of course, drug offenses, certainly issues involving the mentally ill and veterans. Most people know someone who has either had an addiction or mental health issue, and that's across the board. Those don't discriminate on ideological or racial lines. You know, there are some issues that, you know, to be perfectly candid, in these polling don't resonate as well. I mean, I think racial disparities is a very important topic. It's not one that, you know, particularly in talking to conservatives, that if you lead with that, it doesn't tend to move the needle, according to this polling research. And when you do talk about that, you also have to be clear that a lot of the reasons we see that, I mean, we know, for example, all races use drugs in the same numbers, but it happens to be that police are targeting certain areas, rightfully so, because those have the highest rates of violent crime. So then someone is much more likely to be caught with drugs if they live in one of those areas. So the disparity may not have originated anybody's bad intent, and we don't want to remove police from those areas, but we do need to do things like, when you look at a risk needs assessment, you don't want to consider perhaps drug possession in your risk assessment, and certainly not arrests that didn't lead to convictions, because you know those are going to lead to disparities, and so that aren't correlated with any predictive value. So there are some, you know, the public safety has to be number one. You have to convince people that what you're doing is not going to make them at greater danger, and that's the critical point. And we actually, fortunately, can prove that the stuff that people in this room are doing actually is going to make us safer. And people are, I mean, a lot of the strongest support we've had is among social conservatives. People do really identify with the idea of redemption. It's a tenet of every major religion that people can change. Most Americans believe in second chances. So the second chance argument is one that's very powerful with people. So there are a lot of great entry points with conservative elected officials on this. You know, we typically don't lead with saving money, but that is kind of an appetizer that often brings people to the table. Part of, as I said, in Texas, the whole thing got rolling because there was this projection that we would have to spend all this money if we didn't do something. So sometimes that's an impetus. Sometimes in the juvenile system, for example, reports of terrible abuses in juvenile facilities, like that just came out this week in Florida, that can often get people off the dime, and then you have those solutions ready that folks can immediately adopt.